Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. President Emerson Mnangagwa was sworn in on Monday. And since then, all the minions have followed suit. Councillors, MPs, senators, vice presidents, and so forth, they've all taken their oath of office, including the opposition Triple C elected officials. Just to remind ourselves again, these elections were declared flawed and illegal by SADC and the African Union. Other institutions like the European Union, the Commonwealth, they did the same thing. But in the past, in 2018, for instance, the European Union condemned those elections, but it didn't mean much. Because as long as Zanu PF had the regional body and the continental body supporting it and giving it legitimacy, that was good enough. Not so this year. This is that is the subtle difference. This year, even the regional body has said these elections are flawed. Even the continental body has said these elections are flawed. They could not possibly produce a legitimate government. It really doesn't require rocket science to come to that conclusion. These elections were carried out, and ZEC failed to produce even something as basic as a verified voters roll. Violence, as we know, was rampant. The public media was not free and fair in its coverage of the political competitors and so forth. So it was really easy for SADC and the AU to say, no, this is not right. To be quite honest, they'd known all these things all along. They'd not said so, but they'd known it all along. Now, they finally decided enough is enough. And by saying these elections are flawed and illegitimate, and they cannot produce a legitimate regime, and they made it that very clear, that did not stop Mnangagwa taking his oath of office. And like I said, all the others following behind. We have got a regime that is determined to stay in power. And unfortunately, we have got the opposition that is content to play along. If the opposition had accepted the election, their process, they have participated in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that by participating, you're giving the regime legitimacy. They've also known that as long as the regime has got so much power to rig the process, it really is futile to keep on participating and expecting change. But they've persisted purely out of greed. So now we have got the whole government set up. And this video is just a sample of what happened in their first day of parliament. So what we had there was the Triple C MPs chanting in Parliament. And later on, Zanu PF took over, and the two sides were competing to out-sing each other. What Zimbabwe needs is a competent government. What Zimbabwe needs is a legitimate government. After 43 years of this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical regime, the country is desperate for change. And SADC, by this time coming decisively to condemn the Zimbabwe elections, I think they've done Zimbabwe a great favor. They've given us the opportunity to turn over a new leaf, to finally address the elephant in the room, the case of rigged elections. It is, of course, disappointing that 43 years and counting after independence, we still cannot hold free, fair, and credible elections. This is an outrage. It's not rocket science. The main problem we have here is we've got a ruling party, Zanu PF, that fought in the War of Liberation. Initially, they believed in one man, one vote. But as the war progressed and signs were that the party was going to win the election, the war, the party hardened this position. Zanu PF, it is no secret that Zanu PF wanted a de facto one-party state, a de jure one-party state rather. But the other brother who was fighting the war as well, liberation, PF SAPU, they tried to form one party. And this is where the Patriotic Front comes from. They could never agree on who was going to hold what position. And they could never trust each other to keep that promise, even if they had. And so the Patriotic Front never really took off. The two parties mistrust each other. And if you're going to have a de facto, de jure one-party state, then it was impossible, of course, because they could not even come up united a position on that issue at the Lancaster House talks. And of course, the Smith and the Muzorewa faction that were also in those talks did not want a one-party state, naturally. So in the end, Zimbabwe signed the Lancaster House Constitution, which agreed to a multi-party political system, democracy. But there's no doubt that Zanu PF's mind was still set on creating a de facto one-party state. As for allowing for free, fair, and credible elections, Zanu PF did not allow for free, fair, and credible elections. They made it very clear, in fact, in the 1980 elections, which was the first elections to be held post-independence. that if Zanu PF does not win the elections, the bush war will continue. Of course, the ordinary Zimbabweans were sick and tired of the bush war, and they voted to end the bush war. You cannot call that a free, fair, and credible election. And after Zanu PF got into power, all they've ever done was consolidate their position, their hold on power. In fact, 3 years after independence, they fell out with their colleague, PF Sapu, and launched the Kukurawundi. The primary purpose of the Kukurawundi was to coerce PF Sapu to give up its political party ambition and join Zanu PF. And by 1987, PF Sapu relented. By then, over 20,000 innocent civilians had been killed in that war, and most of those were PF Sapu supporters. And when Sapu signed the Unity Accord of 1987, it cleared the way for Zanu PF to declare de facto one-party state. And that is what has existed in Zimbabwe up to this day. It is tragic that the country had many golden opportunities to end the Zanu PF dictatorship, particularly during the GNU of 2008 to 2013. And the party that was tasked to carry out that function was MDC, the forerunner of today's CCC. Most of the leaders that are in CCC today, they were in the MDC, T, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, or MDC N, or M, from Tambara, and then later on changed to MDC N, led by Welshman Nuwe. Those MDC two factions failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change in Zimbabwe. It is interesting that after these elections of 2023, even when SADC had declared them null and void, CCC leaders still went on to participate by taking up their seats in parliament. All done out of greed, pure and simple. This is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. We have the ruling party that believes that it has got the divine right to rule the country, and has ruled the country with an iron fist. The elections on the 23rd of August, they were a farce. This is a regime that was not going to accept defeat, and so they had to rig the elections to be certain that they've got victory. The opposition participated in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was rigging them, but out of greed. They also knew that Zanu PF was giving away a few gravy train seats, and they couldn't resist that. What I find really disappointing is the number of ordinary Zimbabweans who still subscribe to this notion that CCC had to participate in the flawed elections. Some have been arguing, how else would they have exposed the rigging so that SADC could see it? That is just nonsense. SADC saw the rigging after the 2008 elections, and they're the ones who sponsored the GNU, which was tasked to implement the reforms. Why did MDC fail to implement the reforms then? Why? Towards the end of that GNU, when SADC realized that no meaningful reforms had been implemented, it was SADC leaders themselves who urged Morgan Tsvangirai and company not to participate in the 2013 elections without reforms. Morgan Tsvangirai and company went on to participate in those elections without even one reform. Are we going to say then that Morgan Tsvangirai and company failed to implement even one reform when they had the golden chance to implement the reforms during the GNU because they wanted to let Zanu PF continue rigging the elections so that SADC will have something to discover? That is a flawed argument. We can't say that they continued participating in flawed elections so that SADC gave us something to report on. That too is a flawed argument. And to argue that they had to take up their seats because they had fought so hard to win these seats in the just entered elections, that too is a flawed argument. By failing to implement the reforms, what MDC stroke CCC have done is help perpetuate the Zanu PF dictatorship. By insisting in participating in this election, even after SADC had said these elections are flawed, what CCC are doing is actually undermining SADC and the AU's position to say, no, we have got to have a clean start. And they're doing it purely out of greed. This is a point that many Zimbabweans are failing to understand. During the last GNU of 2008 to 2013, MDCT failed to implement even one meaningful reform. While we can blame them, we also have got to look in the mirror and realize that we too, the ordinary people, are to blame because we did not do anything to make sure that those reforms were implemented. Even when SADC took the initiative of trying to get the MDC guys to implement reforms, we never spoke up in support of SADC. We cannot afford to have this opportunity wasted. Yes, Mnangagwa has been sworn in as president. His two vice presidents have been sworn in. MPs, senators, everybody have been sworn in and taken their seats. This is still an illegitimate regime. The process that created this regime was so flawed and so illegal, it could not possibly produce a legitimate regime. And that message we must send very loudly and very clearly. And we must stand up and be counted that we totally support SADC's call that these elections are null and void. SADC's next thing will be to pressure the regime to accept that reality. And I think we must also play our part in reminding the regime that it is illegitimate. What I would suggest to SADC is that they should get outside assistance. The last GNU was formed as part of this African solution to African problems. It did not work. I think SADC should reach out to the UN, for instance, for help, even if it's purely symbolic, that this is now an initiative that is being backed by the UN. We in Zimbabwe cannot afford another failed GNU. But I can see a big solution, a big problem here. Zanu PF is not going to give up power. Particularly now, it was tough enough in the first GNU when they were asked to be part or a parcel of the government of national unity. This time, we cannot afford to have Zanu PF play any role at all, just as much as we can't afford to have CCC play any role. Because we know they failed to implement even one reform during the last GNU. What chance is there that they will get the job done this time? I think by getting the UN involved, that will show Zanu PF that we are serious and we mean business this time. We want those reforms implemented, and they must be implemented. Zimbabwe must get away from this curse of rigged elections. The right of every Zimbabwean to a meaningful say in the governance of the country must be restored. And the only way to make sure that that is restored is implementing the democratic reforms that takes away all these carte blanche powers that Zanu PF has to rig elections. Yes, our friends, CCC, would also want to play a key role in the GNU. But I think we can't afford to just appease them. They failed to implement any reforms during the GNU. They have continued to keep on participating in flawed elections since then. And even now, when SADC had declared that this election process is flawed, they've taken up their seats. Proof that CCC have moved from being the party that's supposed to implement the reforms. During the GNU, they'd given up the reforms. They failed to implement even one. And yet they've continued to pretend that they're still working for the ordinary people. And they've been running with the povo hair during the day, and yet hunting with the Zanu PF hounds at night. Because they have not implemented any reforms. They've participated in flawed elections, knowing fully well that this will only give Zanu PF legitimacy and perpetuate the dictatorship. But with this taking up their seats in parliament, I think they have now gone to the point where they are now hunting with the Zanu PF hounds in broad daylight. And if anyone thinks that qualifies them to be in the new GNU, they are wrong. We must make our position very clear. We want these reforms implemented. And we are not going to accept this illegitimate Zanu PF regime, regardless of all the people who have been sworn in and taken their seats. Zimbabwe must deal with this case of rigged elections. Now, after 45 years of kicking the can down the road, we must deal with this problem. This issue must be resolved. If there's one thing this generation must do, it is to resolve this case of rigged elections. Let's clear the plate so that future generations have got a chance of building a meaningful and prosperous Zimbabwe. They cannot do it as long as the case of rigged elections remains with us. This within our powers to deal with it, and we must deal with it. And I once again salute SADC and the AU for stepping up and taking up the challenge. If they had not done so, I think we'll be looking now at a situation where we have got the Zanu PF dictatorship for the next 5 years again. At the present moment, we don't. All we have got to do is make sure we do not have the Zanu PF regime does not get away with the rigged elections. We must not allow that to happen. We must stand up and be counted and back up SADC. We failed to do so last time. This time we must not be found wanting. This fight is to restore democratic rule in Zimbabwe. And we should not be fooled by triple C's and D's. They are no longer fighting in the corner of the ordinary Zimbabwean. They are fighting, and they have been fighting in the corner of Zanu PF. And we must insist that these two parties must have no part whatsoever to play in the GNU that is coming. Enough is enough. We have the opportunity to deliver, to end this case of rigged elections. Let's do it. Let's keep our eyes on the ball. This fight is not over, not by a long shot. This fight has only just begun. Zanu PF must give up power. The regime is illegitimate. It was flawed and illegal, and such a process cannot deliver a legitimate regime. That message must be said and be emphasized, and it is not negotiable. Thank you and good night.